Julie had not crossed the border yet, and her mother was already calling. Mothers. She looked at her phone, but didn't pick it up. It was Christmas Eve, and Julie had promised her mother that she would drop by as soon as she arrived to help out with the last-minute preparation, a promise Julie now wished she hadn't made. It was already past 6. The line at the Canadian border was much longer than usual, and the lane Julie's car was in was moving the slowest. The drive from New York City had been dreadful. Rain and fog all the way up to Albany, followed by sleet, snow, and powdered snow throughout the Adirondacks. And now, welcoming Julie back at the Canadian border was a dreaded wintry mix. It was as if wet, thick mucus was dripping from the sniffing skies. Julie, who always religiously checked the weather forecast before planning any trip back home, didn't like any of this. This was nothing like what had been forecasted, and the last thing Julie wanted was to get stuck in Montreal because of some freaky, unannounced winter storm. What the hell, Julie said out loud. She fumbled with the radio in search of a local forecast, but quickly had to turn it off. She just couldn't stand listening to French-Canadian radio station, with their obnoxiously loud and tacky commercial and the exaggerated slang of the announcers. Still more unbearable was during the holidays, when all you heard were the same old Christmas carols, the same old folkloric songs, or absolute worse, Céline Dion singing All I Want for Christmas Is You in French. Yet, Julie could never bring herself to listen to an English-speaking station either. It was silly, of course. She had just been happy listening to NPR for most of the drive up the New York Thruway. But as soon as she approached the border, it was as if an old reflex was kicking in, like that of a dead man's twitching limb after his last breath. Like most French Canadians, Julie had grown up with little connection to the Anglophone part of her hometown. And although she had lived the last 20 years of her life entirely in English, to listen to Anglo radio while in Quebec still made her feel like a traitor. Silly, but there you had it. Silly too was how she now insisted on addressing the Canadian border agent in French, even though he was clearly not a French speaker. She always did that. After all those years, there was still that tiny, resentful part of her that wanted to see English Canadians struggle when obligated to speak French, just as she had struggled with her English as a young teenage girl looking for a job. Merci, she said impishly, as the agent gave her back her American passport. Once she crossed the border, Julie sped up, but she had to slow down when the car fishtailed. Her phone rang, but she kept both hands on the wheels and both eyes on the road. She didn't need to look to know that it was her mother, Colette, calling again. Colette hung up the phone. She looked out of her kitchen window. A wet, fat snow had begun to accumulate on the tip of the dome of the Oratoire Saint-Joseph, which poked Montreal's skyline like a giant lactating breast. The thermostat read just below 0 Celsius, which Colette, who still used the old system in her head, translated to roughly 32 Fahrenheit. Mild, but dangerous. Soon everything would turn to ice. Ice was number one reason why so many old folks left Quebec for Florida during winter. But Colette, who had just turned 81, had never been to Florida, nor did she want to. Her bones were strong, but stronger still was Colette's belief in a promised land called Quebec. You see, Colette was a true believer. And if you were a true believer, you knew your history. And if you knew your history, you understood that you didn't survive the Iroquois, British colonization, American cultural imperialism, Canadian federalism, not to mention second-class citizenship, historical poverty, and the subjugation of the Catholic Church, just to abandon your homeland because the temperature dropped below 0 for a couple of months. No less important was the fact that winter was when Christmas was, and Christmas Day was when Colette, like matriarchs all over Quebec, was receiving her children and their partners and whatever offspring they managed to produce for dinner. It was Christmas Eve, and the bells of the Oratoire Saint-Joseph were tolling 8 o'clock already. Where on earth was that daughter of hers? Julie had promised that she would come and help. For an entire month now, Colette had been shopping and cooking and cleaning and running herself ragged, and there was still so much left to do. On her kitchen counter were half-empty bags of flour, unlabeled spices, scattered handwritten lists, and prehistoric newspaper recipes. In the corner was a big pile of vegetables that had yet to be cut, prepared and cooked. Colette could definitely use a hand with the vegetables. In fact, Julie had mentioned that she would take care of all the vegetables, although she had, in that same phone conversation, dismiss or ignore any of Colette's requests for more detailed information, such as which vegetables exactly Julie had in mind. But at last, after a back and forth of questions and evasion that had made Colette feel as if she was waterboarding, metaphorically speaking, her own daughter, Julie had reluctantly offered possible options, such as butternut squash, Brussels sprouts, or broccoli, all reasonable as well as acceptably seasonable choices. But then, just before hanging up, Julie had mentioned something else, arugula. Arugula what? Arugula, Mom. It's a kind of lettuce? Oh, I don't think we have that here, Colette said. And it was true that she had never heard of arugula. She sighed, another of those trendy American things her daughter kept adopting year after year. Oh, forget about it then, Juliette said, with her usual dismissive tone. Just thought it would be nice to have some raw greens on the table. But Colette was someone whose very DNA made the dismissal of anything, even the smallest, most insignificant detail, impossible. For days afterwards, Colette scoured every produce aisle of every grocery store in the neighborhood for that thing called arugula, to no avail. And it was only when she had basically given up, although not before first, choosing watercress as the most adequate alternative. Secondly, convincing herself that watercress may very well be, in fact, arugula. And thirdly, concluding that her daughter must have misspoke, or more likely, mistranslated. It was only then, as Colette stood in line in the specialized vegetable store all the way up the hill, holding in her hands 3 big, wet, cold bunches of watercress, that she thought of asking the Chinese-looking, and therefore most probably English-speaking, cashier if she had ever heard of something called arugula. Right there, ma'am, the cashier said, pointing towards a shelf filled with plastic containers of different greens and lettuces. Colette took a few skeptical steps towards it, but as she got closer, she heard the cashier behind her repeating, "Rocket, madame, rocket." Colette looked around frenetically, wondering what on earth this poor Chinese woman was referring to, until she finally spotted a row of lettuce under a sign that read Roquette, and in smaller letters, rocket lettuce / arugula. So there it was. Colette picked one of the rocket boxes and examined it, still holding her dripping watercress in the other hand. She hesitated. A part of her felt no small amount of pride in having persisted, and through the sheer force of her persistence, found something she'd come to believe did not even exist. She could already imagine herself telling Julie, "Of course we have arugula here in Quebec, but the right word is actually roquette." Her daughter could put that in her pipe and smoke it. At the same time, Colette felt quite annoyed, and although she would have not been able to tell you why, it probably had to do with the trouble that this week-long search, a simple mention, uttered by her daughter, had inflicted on Colette's already busy schedule. Trouble that could have been avoided had the simple mention simply been mentioned in the right language. But at the end, pride won. At the end, pride always wins. Colette grabbed 2 boxes of rocket, dropped the watercress in their place, caught her breath just for a second before giving the cashier the extravagant amount of $8 Canadian. The church bells rang 9 times, 3 hours before midnight mass, and still no call from Julie. Colette began preparing her maple syrup pies, eyeing with distress the unprepared vegetables on the counter. Why must her daughter always leave everything to the last minute? Colette herself was a firm believer in planning ahead, and now that her aging brain wasn't quite as quick as it once had been, her memory not quite as excellent, planning had become absolutely essential if Colette was to maintain a semblance of matriarchal authority. Not that Colette was so keen on maintaining any kind of authority. She was old and tired, but did she have a choice? Take Christmas, for example. A few years back, in implicit acknowledgement of Colette's advanced age, all three children had decided to take over the organization, a generous word, of the annual family gathering. The results? Chaotic, pell-mell affairs centered around a constantly evolving and experimental meal, which ended up consisting of whatever everyone's latest fancy was. Dear Lord, one year has been sushi, followed by pecan duck, which may have been original, but not quite in the spirit of Christmas. Another year, an entire dinner made of various unrelated and lightweight tapas that left everyone starving and much drunker than necessary. So this year, Colette had no choice but to take charge once again. By November, she'd planned the entire meal, which, she announced, would be a traditional Québécois Christmas dinner, like the ones her own mother Josette used to prepare. There would be turkey, stuffed with wild rice, sage, ground pork, and cranberries. A good old tortilla pie, but made the traditional way, with 3 ground meats and homemade tomato ketchup. Her mother's famous boulettes de viande, which were really a British take on meatballs, but no one needed to know that. And the meal's centerpiece, a classic pig's feet ragout. Granted, it was a meat-heavy menu, and unfortunately, Colette had forgotten to ask Julie if she was still a vegetarian, which was why she had bought butternut squash and broccoli and Brussels sprout along with the arugula thing. Also, but only if absolutely necessary, there was a pound of shrimp in the freezer that could be quickly thawed. The phone rang, and Colette ran to pick it up. Julie?